Universal's monsters are enduring classics that have shaped pop culture for nearly a century. Universal's Dark Universe, on the other hand, came and went like a bump in the night. While attempting to revive their pantheon of haunted creatures and create the evil equivalent of Marvel's Avengers, the intended shared universe began and ended with 2017's The Mummy. The film's hijacked production delivered a failure so monstrous that it unraveled years' worth of planning, forever entombing the franchise in a shit show. Universal Studios, the house that monsters built. In the world of horror, nothing is more iconic than Universal's classic monsters. From Bela Lugosi's quintessential portrayal as Dracula,
I am Dracula,
all the way down to the neck bolts on Frankenstein's monster. Whether they were based on classic novels or brand new creations, these trailblazing creature features pioneered optical and makeup techniques, pushed the boundaries of censorship, scared generations the world over, inspired countless filmmakers, and defined Halloween costumes forever. After spawning dozens of sequels, Universal did something no one had ever done before and brought the monsters together on the silver screen. Starting in 1943 with Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and followed by House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, the films did not simply contain a version of these boogeyman, but instead functioned as sequels to their respective franchises. These monster mashups, called monster rallies at the time, were the first of their kind, the original cinematic universe.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
When the horror well started running dry by the late 1940s, Universal paired their monsters with their comedy all-stars Bud Abbott and Lou Costello for multiple horror comedies. The duo would meet Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Invisible Man, among others. There was also the confusingly titled Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer, Boris Karloff, where Karloff is not playing himself, nor is he the killer, but whatever. By the time they met the Mummy, Universal was ready to abandon their monsters altogether, choosing to let the British production company, Hammer Films, pick up the torch. Hammer reimagined the same monsters in a campy gothic style, adding sex appeal, blood and gore, and glorious Technicolor. Hammer dominated low-budget horror throughout the 60s and 70s, before withering away into bankruptcy. Outside of one Dracula remake in 1979, Universal didn't return to their household creations for over 40 years. They made some half-hearted attempts at remakes in the early 90s that were never fleshed out. Conan the Barbarian's John Milius was set for The Wolfman, and Martin Scorsese debated Bride of Frankenstein. However, the juice left their Tesla coils when Sony produced 4 prestigious, adult-oriented horror films: Bram Stoker's Dracula, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Wolf, and Mary Riley. That's Dr. Jekyll's maid, apparently. Results were varied. Universal then decided to chart a completely different path with The Mummy in 1999. Digging up a low-budget remake has been a prize Universal has yearned for since the 80s.
Do you ever yearn?
Yearn? Do I yearn?
I yearn.
The likes of George Romero, Clive Barker, Mick Garris, Joe Dante, and John Sayles gave it their best, before Deep Rising director Stephen Sommers pitched a grand Indiana Jones-style action-adventure. The Mummy was a superficial yet highly enjoyable and strangely sexy romp that outperformed Universal's expectations, making more than $400 million worldwide.
I loved the whole sand wall trick. It was beautiful, you bastard.
The immediately ordered sequel, The Mummy Returns in 2001, made just as much, but is considered a shallower follow-up, with a legacy overshadowed by one truly dodgy-looking rock.
Well, that's not good.
Having given them 2 straight blockbusters based on one horror creature, Universal let Sommers play in their entire monster sandbox. Sommers wrote and directed Van Helsing in 2004, pitting the vampire hunter against Mr. Hyde, Frankenstein's monster, werewolves, and Dracula. Universal was so convinced that this would be their next big franchise, they ordered a sequel, a video game, an anime, and kept the Transylvania set intact for a future television series. In spite of that, Van Helsing did not slay the box office. While not an outright bomb, the loud, soulless monster mash, filled to the brim with overwhelming CGI, lacked the charm of The Mummy and failed with audiences and critics. Then NBC deemed their Transylvania TV series too expensive to produce.
You always this popular?
Pretty much.
Universal was dumbstruck and retreated to a third Mummy, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, in 2008.
Here we go again.
The less said about this one, the better. But the reviews were so harsh, Universal deserted plans for a fourth film with Antonio Banderas as an Aztec adversary.
Maybe there is another way.
For the next decade, Universal attempted to resurrect multiple other monsters and had little to show for it. The Blade trilogy's David Goyer tried developing the Invisible Man. The illusionist Neil Berger almost revitalized Bride of Frankenstein. The Last Voyage of the Demeter was commissioned in 2003 but wouldn't come ashore for another 20 years. And Creature from the Black Lagoon never resurfaced, despite the efforts of John Landis, Ivan Reitman, John Carpenter, and Pleasantville's Gary Ross, whose father co-wrote the original film. Even Guillermo del Toro pitched a horror romance for the Gill Man that Universal rejected. He eventually formed that idea into The Shape of Water. And he also nearly rebooted Van Helsing with Tom Cruise, star of Cocktail.
I make drinks so sweet and snazzy, the iced tea, the kamikaze.
The only film to make it to the finish line was 2010's The Wolfman with Benicio del Toro. An enormously expensive blunder that you should definitely learn more about by watching this riveting podcast. Like and subscribe, I guess. Since the third Mummy was so widely derided, Universal chose to reboot the franchise in 2012.
Here we go again.
The first to bring fire to the project was Prometheus screenwriter John Spates, and he was keen on returning the creature to its horror roots. But after weathering a few bad years, Universal wanted to guarantee the film wouldn't stay sealed away, and hired the Hunger Games writer Billy Ray to draft a competing script, so Universal would have options. Shortly after, they nabbed producing and writing duo Roberto Orci and Alex Kurtzman, who made Paramount millions with their work on Transformers and Star Trek. They were to undertake a reboot of Van Helsing with Tom Cruise, star of Rock of Ages, still attached, and produce The Mummy. And since Marvel's Avengers was all the rage, the two films were meant to connect. Orci left 2 years later, and once Kurtzman was paired with Chris Morgan, the madman behind Universal's lucrative Fast and Furious franchise, the idea snowballed into something much grander. In the summer of 2014, sick of rival studios launching their own cinematic universes, when Universal pioneered the idea in the first place, Universal announced their master plan to reboot their roster of monsters into one shared universe. A lavish renovation for the house that monsters built.
Welcome to a new world of gods and monsters.
Copying Disney's successful blueprint, Universal hoped to combine a strategic mind like the MCU's Kevin Feige with a creative brain trust like Pixar. For Universal, the architects of this new venture would be Kurtzman and Morgan. The two men assembled a writer's room of top-tier talent, from Fargo showrunner Noah Hawley to blockbuster king David Koepp. These 10 high-profile writers would pick a character to develop while also providing notes for the others, and they were unofficially known as the Monster Men. No girls, of course.
Can't you read? Mom says you have to let me in the club or else it's prescription.
That's discrimination, jerkoid.
Much like Marvel, the films would function like a serialized television show in the soon-to-be-titled Dark Universe. In order for this to work, Universal halted development on any lingering monster project so they could relaunch them all under this new banner. There was just one problem. They already had a Dracula film waiting in the wings. Dracula Untold was first conceived in 2007 as Dracula Year Zero, to be directed by Alex Proyas and starring Sam Worthington. But Universal drove a stake through it when the budget got too high.
Oh my God! There's so much blood!
In 2012, during the height of the gritty reboot phase, they revived the project. This reimagining is a very loose historical origin for the legendary vampire. reframing Vlad the Impaler Dracula, an actual horrifying Romanian warlord, into a noble anti-hero. Luke Evans of Fast and Furious and Hobbit fame donned the infamous fangs. As for director, they turned to Gary Shore, who had yet to make a feature film in his career, and they gave him a frightening $70 million to sink his teeth into. Filming finished in November of 2013, and Universal thought the movie was a bloody mess. Luckily, they now had their monster men to consult on changes. Untold went through extensive reshoots, from fixing a dead-end love story to replacing Charlie Cox with Charles Dance as an ancient vampire. It also gave Gary Shore an opportunity to follow Kurtzman and Morgan's goal to gather the monsters in modern times. Craving to be part of that roadmap, Shore crafted a new present-day ending, with Dracula being stalked by Charles Dance's character, potentially setting him up as the crossover character a la Nick Fury.
Let the games begin.
Shore presented this as an optional Dark Universe starter, but Universal didn't want to make any final plans until they saw the box office numbers. Still, at the movie's premiere, the filmmakers were more than happy to advertise that their film was now joining the shared monster universe.
It's part of the launch of the Monster, the revamp. Yeah, I was really excited to be a part of that. When we started out, we weren't, but then we found out that they were going to do it, and working with Alex Kurtzman and Chris Morgan, who are very much a part of creating The Mummy and the other ones, it's been fun to be a part of all that.
Dracula Untold was unleashed on October 10th, 2014. With a budget that swelled to $100 million, Untold bombed in the US, but did okay overseas. Splitting the difference, reviews called it a dull comic book wannabe rendered toothless by its PG-13 rating, allowing Universal to throw the film under the bus and denying it had anything to do with their upcoming Dark Universe. With Dracula Untold stuffed into a coffin, Kurtzman and Morgan had full control of their film slate.
Well, look, our Dark Universe is built on the classic Universal monsters, so we know we're going to do Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Dracula, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Phantom of the Opera, Hunchback of Notre Dame, Invisible Man, and there are characters within those films that can, grow and expand and maybe even spin off.
And the start of this new universe would begin with a remake of The Mummy.
Here we go again.
Probably chosen for its brand recognition, as are all tentpoles these days. After going through directors Len Wiseman and Andy Muschietti, Universal just let Kurtzman take the top spot. Or did they?
Do it!
Okay. Kurtzman would also rewrite the script with Rachel Getting Married's Jenny Lumet. They switched the mummy from a high priest to an Egyptian princess and gave her the betrayal-turned-vengeance backstory. Somewhere in this madness, Tom Cruise remained interested in being part of the Dark Universe.
I assume I need no introduction.
And if Universal could get the fifth build star of The Outsiders, they wanted the rest to be the creme de la creme. Johnny Depp was cast as the Invisible Man, Javier Bardem as Frankenstein's monster, after he declined Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which in turn went to Russell Crowe. They hunted down The Rock for the Wolfman, Channing Tatum for Van Helsing, and for The Bride of Frankenstein, they sought out Angelina Jolie to star and direct, which would be Universal's next planned operation. The 1935 original is widely regarded as not only the best film to come out of Universal's classic era, but also one of the greatest horror films ever made. The remake, written by David Koepp, twists Mary Shelley's novel by having Dr. Frankenstein create the bride first. When Jolie said no to directing, Universal wanted Bill Condon, as he directed and won an Oscar for writing Gods and Monsters, about the last days of James Whale, the director of Invisible Man, Frankenstein, and Bride of Frankenstein. Needless to say, Condon was just what the doctor ordered.
There wasn't even a debate, about who should be directing this movie, because you're talking about someone who just in their DNA understands it. I think that it's all about figuring out who speaks to the spirit of these films, who understands them the most, and which writers come up with takes that are honoring the tradition and the heritage while bringing something new to the table. And it's hard, we don't want to make these movies until they're worth making, until they're right.
Yeah, about that. As much as Universal and Alex Kurtzman showed a unified front, flaunting the designs of this new house, there was already a monster on the inside. And it was called Creative Differences. Universal's biggest concern was that they don't own the concept of monsters. Most of theirs are in the public domain. And for the last century, pop culture has been awash with vampires and werewolves and Invisible Man and Frankenstein-ish monsters, be it horror, drama, or comedy.
Hey, don't swear.
Sorry,
We're werewolves.
Not swear.
What are we?
Werewolves, not swearwolves.
So these movies needed to stand out, and they needed to reach the widest possible audience to offset the cost. Meaning they had to be fun, not too scary, appeal to non-horror fans, and certainly not be rated R. Essentially, 1999's The Mummy. Less horror, more roller coaster. This ran counter to Kurtzman's vision of a filmmaker-centric franchise, where each project didn't have to fit a Marvel-like mold. The rating, the content, the budget would be up to them. And this fracture showed cracks all the way down to the foundation. Screenwriters John Spates and Eric Heiserer felt the Monster Men were less a cohesive mind meld and more a bickering family incapable of agreeing with one another.
You know, you had some people saying, well, should our monsters all be villains in these movies, or can they all be heroes? And, it's somebody else who said, well, we're going to build the plane as we fly it. And it was me and John Spates at the table going, that is a terrible analogy.
Realizing this all could be a disaster, Spates and Heiserer selfishly chose to write the Van Helsing reboot, figuring in the high likelihood the other movies turned out bad, at least their hero could be the one to kill off that respective monster. But it need not go that far. Before Universal greenlit any further Dark Universe project, they wanted to see the reaction to The Mummy, because prospects were grim. The film was already wrapped up in Tom Cruise drama. In addition to his $13 million starring fee plus a back-end percentage, the legend star's contract was substantial, including script, editing, and marketing approval. And even before he signed, they had to get his consent to give Kurtzman the director's chair. Cruise promptly brought in new writers, including his best good Mission Impossible buddy, Christopher McQuarrie, to increase his role in the film by adding the possession twist, while sidelining Sofia Boutella's titular mummy. Universal wasn't happy with these changes, as the monsters were always meant to be the central characters. But they also wanted to be in the Tom Cruise business. When filming began in April 2016, production almost immediately went off course. Despite years in the business, Kurtzman had only ever directed one film, the small-budget family drama People Like Us. With The Mummy, he seemed overwhelmed by the sheer size of the picture. Sensing a power vacuum, Cruise took near total control over the film, micromanaging every detail. From shooting the plane crash sequence in actual zero-G versus the planned in-studio setup.
Tom said, yeah, this sounds great, we'll build a set, but we're also going to do it for real. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, we're going to do it on the zero-G plane.
To pulling in his own editor when he felt the film wasn't working. The crew fell into two camps. Those who thought the project was troubled from the outset and Cruise was doing everything in his power to save it and keep things on schedule, or those who believed Cruise was turning the film into another Mission Impossible-style vanity project. Regardless, they all began deferring their questions to Cruise rather than Kurtzman. For his part, Kurtzman acknowledges that mistakes were made, calling the experience painful, and regrets not speaking up when he felt in his gut that things were wrong.
I tend to subscribe to the point of view that you learn nothing from your successes and you learn everything from your failures. And that was probably the biggest failure of my life, both personally and professionally. There's about 1 million things I regret about it.
Running out and both of us are slowing to the mark. Just be like, it's like, we're running out. It's like, whoa, let's try that. That kind of.
But it also gave me so many gifts that are inexpressibly beautiful. I didn't become a director until I made that movie, and it wasn't because it was well directed. It was because it wasn't.
Apparently, he had a very good time.
As opening weekend neared, Universal's tracking showed the film wasn't generating enough excitement. And accidentally uploading a trailer without music or sound effects wasn't exactly the kind of buzz they asked for.
No.
Worried that they'd be crushed by Wonder Woman, Universal hastily devised a public unveiling of the Dark Universe. Along with the name, the logo, a theme by Danny Elfman, and adding Christopher McQuarrie to the Monster Men, they also gathered the currently signed stars for a photo op. But that too proved difficult, as the very busy actors were unable to meet all at once and the released portrait photoshopped them together. Smelling the desperation, the internet didn't bite. The Mummy reawakened June 9th, 2017. Reviews were merciless. Narratively chaotic, tonally disjointed, and more concerned with its special effects, franchise building, and a showboating star in lieu of being a horror flick.
You're welcome, by the way.
How's that?
Because I saved your... whatever it is.
Some even called it Tom Cruise's worst film ever. Okay, let's all calm down.
Help me! Somebody help me!
On a budget somewhere between $125 million to $195 million, depending on who you ask, with a global marketing blitz and a sizable cut to Cruise himself, the film needed to reach at least $450 million to break even. It made just over $400 million worldwide, with only $80 million of that coming from the US. It was indeed crushed by Wonder Woman. As the filmmakers, producers, and studio executives pointed fingers at each other for the debacle, the gaze eventually turned to Bride of Frankenstein. Bill Condon designed a grand and elaborate Gothic film, but that was no longer going to fly. David Koepp scaled it back, but by the time he turned in the draft, Universal was ready to put it all 6 feet under, and The Bride was removed from their calendar.
The movie that we started was devised as a great big movie, and at the end of the day, probably these movies should be smaller. We were on the verge of making a really beautiful movie, I thought. So that was a shame.
What a filthy job.
Could be worse.
How?
Could be raining.
A mere 5 months after revealing the Dark Universe, Alex Kurtzman, Chris Morgan, and the rest of the Monster Men disbanded. All those eggs in that one sarcophagus, and it was buried by hubris and ego. Universal backpedaled, listening to pitches from anyone still interested in their creatures. John Krasinski longed for Frankenstein's bride, Elizabeth Banks eyed the Invisible Woman, Ryan Gosling begged for Wolfman, and recruiting them all for a dark army was something Paul Feig yearned for.
You yearn.
Oh, yes, I yearn. Often I sit and yearn.
Then Blumhouse Productions, the company behind low-budget horror like the Insidious, Purge, and Paranormal Activity franchises, offered their services to remake any and all classics. At the start of 2019, Universal fully acknowledged the end of the Dark Universe by hiring Saw and Insidious co-creator Lee Winnell to write and direct the Invisible Man remake, as a standalone film. Released on February 28, 2020, the film gleaned glowing reviews, and on a budget of $7 million, it made 20 times that, and would have continued had theaters not shut down due to COVID-19. It seemingly confirmed what audiences actually asked for from these monsters: scares.
Surprise.
But then Winnell's Wolfman remake was criticized for not being scary enough. The Last Voyage of the Demeter was scary but didn't review well, and it sank at the box office, as did the sloppy action comedy Renfield, which aren't great examples of Universal honoring their legacy, but hey, not all those originals were in fact classics. At least Universal let others put their own spin on things, like Kurtzman envisioned. And to their credit, after The Mummy, they left well enough alone. They admitted defeat and didn't force something no one wanted. Because not everything needs a shared universe, or a franchise, or even a sequel. Sometimes a good movie doesn't need to build out into anything else. Sometimes you don't need a house. Sometimes you need an entire amusement park called the Dark Universe, where thrill seekers will encounter the heart-pounding experiences that scar the land, discover unnatural creations that lurk in the shadows, and come face to face with legendary monsters themselves, only at Universal Orlando's Epic Universe.
Orlando, I love you.
Universal, give us money.